back when I was 30 years old, it was easier to squeeze between that small space there. It's a little bit harder now. Thank you all for the opportunity to come here, and I'm going to start off light because what I get into later is a little heavier, and I'm going to offend probably each of you in some way, not deliberately, but I've sort of gotten to the point where at my age I might as well just put it out there, and then we can just have a simple discussion about it, hopefully. But I did tweet the other day. I don't tweet nearly as much as the station would like me to, but I tweeted, I said, are you unhappy with the Trump-Clinton choice for president? Because if you are, you ought to consider voting for a meteorologist for president because they run a high-pressure campaign but never put up a front. Just an option, you know. And then the other thing is, and this is an old joke, and I'm not encouraging any inappropriate behavior here, it is just a joke, okay? There was a married couple sound asleep at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the phone rang, and the husband picked it up, and his wife heard him say into the phone, "How the heck would I know? It's 150 miles from here," and hung up. And she said, "Honey, who was that?" And he says, "I don't know. Somebody called and asked whether or not the coast was clear." Weather joke. All right. So back in the early 1980s, when I first started to attend American Meteorological Society conferences, I bumped into a gentleman who was the state climatologist for the state of Virginia. His name is Pat Michaels. And he was a very charming guy. He had a little bit of a sarcastic nature to him, which drew me to him because my dad had a PhD in sarcasm, and so I was very familiar with that. And this was back when the whole subject of global warming was first being talked about, and the satellite record, which really only started in 1979, so it was in its infancy, was actually showing cooling. And there were a number of other arguments that Pat made very convincingly about the fact that, well, the climate models are indicating that most of the warming is going to be in the Arctic during the winter, which means those really cold air masses that come down here in January and February won't be as cold. What's not to like about that? And that the growing seasons would be longer, and all of this was good, so what's the problem? And then in 1984, and again, I'm just full disclosure here. 1984, I changed my voter registration from Democrat to Republican because at that time, right or wrong, I thought that the Republican Party's overall value system, I guess, was closer to the way I had been brought up, even though both my parents were staunch Democrats. And so, and you might remember, those of you that have been here a long time, that was the year of the Hunt-Helms Senate race, which was pretty intense. So, and then in the 90s, like any good Republican, I started carving out 3 hours a day to listen to Rush. And so he was so we already causing problems here? And he was obviously a smart guy, and he did his homework, and he thought the whole climate change thing was a hoax, so I had a really good person on my side. And so then as I listened, I started hearing him make comments about just the general physics of meteorology, which weren't quite correct. And I started thinking to myself, well, if he hasn't done his homework on that, what else hasn't he done his homework on? And then and I can't give you an exact date and year and time, but it was sometime around 2005, 2006. I woke up one morning, which in of itself was a good thing. And there was this question in my brain, I don't know who put it there, and the question was directed at me, and the question was this: Greg, are you doing the same thing the people you're criticizing are doing, in the sense that you're only looking for information to support what you already think? And the more I thought about it, the more I had to admit that there was probably quite a bit of that going on. And another thing that sort of struck me was that I went to an institution of higher learning at Penn State that is world known for its department in meteorology, and they taught me scientific principles to adhere by. The basics of the scientific method, which I think are applicable to all areas of life, not just science. That you have a hypothesis. Those are free, they're legal, everybody's entitled to one. Then you're supposed to test it. And the best way to test it is to try to prove yourself wrong. How many of us do that? So, and then of course, if you can't prove yourself wrong, then you have a right to equate your hypothesis with your conclusion. So, I didn't change my mind about global warming that day because I had no new information to change it on. I simply recognized that my thinking process was flawed. I wasn't thinking like a scientist, and it was about time I started. So then I started talking to scientists who actually had backgrounds in climatology and studied climate science, and started reading some of the peer-reviewed literature. And as time went on, it became very difficult for me to make a scientific argument that we were not having any effect. Now, how much? I think that's still a conversation that has some merit. But I've always been struck by the number of people that don't know that if it weren't for the pre-existing levels of carbon dioxide before the Industrial Revolution, we wouldn't be having this lunch right now. Okay, you hear this argument. Nobody disagrees with that, by the way. You always hear this argument, oh, it's a trace gas. How can a trace gas cause us to warm up? Well, the fundamental properties of that were discovered back in the early 1800s by people like Tyndall and Fourier and Arrhenius. So this is not new science. But the Earth's average temperature would be 60 degrees colder, Fahrenheit colder, if it weren't for the pre-existing amount of CO2, methane, and water vapor. Okay? So the Earth would be an uninhabitable ice ball. So a small amount of something can have a huge effect. Okay, so that argument immediately doesn't hold water, no pun intended. So then as I come to the conclusion that yes, we probably are having some effect here, I go to get my driver's license renewed. I got to be totally honest with you, a month late. And the person says, you realize you can now change your voter registration at the same time. Really? I said, what's independent? She said, that's called unaffiliated. And I said, sign me up. And this has really become, I guess, a passion for me over the past couple of years. And I'll just be honest with you, I think our political system's broke. And we live in this world right now where you only have two possible solutions to any problem. It's A and B. They never change. And the people that like the B solution will never support the A, and the people that like the A solution will never support the B. So where do we go? How do we make any progress along those lines? Well, here's a novel idea. Maybe there's a C. Maybe there's an outside-the-box solution C that could actually appease, at least in part, both of these very dichotomous approaches to a given issue. So we had a town hall last Thursday night at the Museum of Natural Sciences, and we had two speakers. Both were very interesting and unique in their own right. One's name was Jordan Kern, who works with the Institute of the Environment at UNC Chapel Hill. And he was extremely objective about the fact that he said in any transition from fossil fuels or any energy source to another, there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. And boy, didn't North Carolina find that out with tobacco? Okay? tobacco farmers were not evil people. They're good people. They worked hard to support their families for years. It just so happens that they were growing something that was having an adverse effect on people's health. And so it was important for us to recognize that they weren't bad people and that let's help them make a transition to something different. And I see the whole fossil fuel thing the same way. The people in the coal industry, I don't want to see the economy in West Virginia tank the way it's tanking. Okay? And quite frankly, those of us that accept the science of climate change, I don't think we show enough empathy for the losers in this transition. And we need to do more of that. And we need to make sure that we're steering these people in a direction that they can still make a living and support their family. And then the other speaker was Bob Inglis. And this is a fascinating story to me. Extremely conservative Republican. The NRA loves this guy. Loves him, okay? And he said until 2008, the only thing he knew about climate change was that if Al Gore swore, I'm against it. He was honest about that. And so he went to Antarctica. He got an invitation to go to Antarctica and talked with some scientists, and they showed him the ice core data and so forth. Bottom line is he came back with a changed mind, and he made it public. And the Tea Party went after him, and in 2 years he went from 85% of the vote in the Republican primary to 29%, and he was out of a job. So he started this nonprofit group called Republic N, which is Republican spelled with EN for energy. And he has told me to my face, he said, Greg, he said, our party is looking at this the wrong way. He said, if we take the lead on developing new technologies for renewable energy, he said there are entrepreneurial opportunities, which then creates jobs, which then stimulates the economy. He said, this is all good stuff. He said, there's enormous opportunity here financially, and he said, we're looking at it the wrong way. You see all of the pictures of China with the people in the gas masks and the smog, and that's all true. I mean, those pictures are not made up. But China is out investing us in solar 3-to-1. And I don't even know if they're doing it for the right reasons. But I think they may be looking at it from the standpoint of, in 20 years, do we want to be buying clean energy from the United States, or do we want to be selling it to them? And maybe we ought to start looking at it the same way. Do we want to be buying clean energy from China in 20 years, or do we want to be selling it to them? So I guess, and I have this theory, I don't know if it's true or not, I can't prove it, so I have a hypothesis and I can't go anywhere with it. But I really think that between 24-hour cable news channels and social media, we have divided this country even more so than it is on its own, in the sense that we've created echo chambers for everybody to run to and hear what they want to hear and see what they want to see. And every time somebody on Twitter says something you agree with, that just entrenches you into that mindset even more so than you were before. And you're not willing to go to another source, as painful as it may be, and listen to what that side has to say. I have a little role play that I do with kids in high school and junior high, where I'll pick somebody out of the audience and say, okay, let's pretend you and I are in Congress, and I know for a fact that you have a view that is 180 from mine. We're just like polar opposites. So I invite you down to Starbucks and I buy you your favorite coffee drink. And I look you straight in the eye and I say, I am sincerely interested in understanding why you have the opinion you do on this issue, and I have to mean it. And then when they're done, hopefully they afford me the same respect. And at the end of the conversation, even if neither one of us has changed our mind, at least we respect that person as a human being because we took the time to listen to them. And we might learn something about that issue that we didn't know before we had that conversation. I don't see a whole lot of that going on today. either in North Carolina or in DC. And then, if I haven't like completely alienated all of you up till now, I'm going to take it a step further. I was brought up in a Christian home. I've been Methodist and Presbyterian all my life. The only difference I can see between the two of them is that one shuffles ministers in more than the other one, in and out. All working for the same boss. And there has become this feeling that you cannot be a person of faith and be a scientist at the same time. Now, there are a lot of obnoxious scientists who are atheists that think that their level of intelligence is as good as it gets. And they literally worship science. They worship their own knowledge. And I don't subscribe to that at all. But I do think science is a gift from God, and I think science is the discovery of God's creation. Every time we discover a new law, a new equation, we find out that whoever set this whole thing up was pretty damn smart. And they knew what they were doing, and there is some order. You know, there's chaos, but there's a lot of order to the universe, which we've discovered over the years. And I think God gave us the ability to do that discovering. And as long as we don't forget who gave us the ability to do it, I don't think he has any problem with us learning. But this argument has been made that how can we be so arrogant to think that we could alter God's system? Well, in 1945, we dropped a couple of bombs on Japan. Whether or not you agree with that or not, I think we pretty much proved to the world that if we want to wipe the place out, we can. We have that power. You have 7 billion people with free will, crap happens. Okay? So, that argument doesn't hold a lot of water with me, but one argument that does is the fact that we're all told to be good stewards of the earth and to take care of it. That doesn't mean you need to be to use one of Rush's terms, an environmentalist wacko, okay? It's just good old-fashioned taking care of what's around you. So I see science and Christianity, or science in any religion, as being very compatible. I feel bad when I see this fight between science and religion, because I don't think it has to be that way. And then one thought that has come to me in recent months, which I wanted to share with you, is that sometimes people will say to me, well, you can't prove that the Earth's temperature will warm by this much by this year. And you know what? You're absolutely right. I can't. Nobody can. Okay? Now, for the people that don't accept the science of climate change, let's ask them the same question. Can you prove that it's zero risk? Because if you can't, then by definition, we have entered into the world of risk assessment. And we all have to collectively decide how much risk we're willing to tolerate. If somebody told you that there was a 2% chance if you let your 2-year-old daughter cross the street without holding her hand, that she'd get killed, would you let her do it? If you had reservations at a restaurant and there was a 5% chance you'd get food poisoning, would you go somewhere else? And I'm not saying that the probability of catastrophic warming is 2%, 5%, or whatever percent. But if there's a way to transition away from something that has the potential to harm us, and we can do it in a way that grows the economy and doesn't hurt it, and do it in a way that actually helps developing countries, like leapfrogging, by landlines straight to cell phones. And English is actually for a revenue neutral carbon tax. It taxes the people that are putting the stuff in the air, but then you reduce the payroll tax because no conservative is in favor of growing the government, right? And that's where he's coming from. So he's basically saying revenue neutral, we're not going to grow the government at all, but let's have people be accountable for spewing stuff into the atmosphere. And he said, tax the thing you don't want and don't tax the thing you do want. Which again is a novel outside the box idea that we don't hear a lot about. So in summary, and by the way, I was willing to be wrong once. I have to be willing to be wrong again. And again, and again. Because if I'm not willing to be wrong now, I have fallen into the same trap I was in the first time, where I'm only going to look for information that supports what I currently think. When I get something in my email box about a skeptical argument about climate change, I don't trash it, I research it. Because what if it's right? What if this person's making a point that I've never considered before? Then I am in the world of confirmation bias. Again, a second time. And I don't want to do that. So I guess my reason, or my main goal in speaking to you all today is not to change your mind about climate change. That's entirely up to you. I'm not here as an advocate. But I am advocating that we consider a different way of thinking. That we are willing to hold a mirror up to ourselves and say, am I only seeking out information to support what I already think? And what would it be like if I made an effort to listen to the other side and really get to know where they're coming from and why they think what they think? I think that a lot of what we're seeing in this country right now would, I don't want to say disappear, but I think we'd at least have a chance of making it a little better. Is that me? It is. I hope that didn't make my whole talk phony. Yeah. Anyways, so that's basically my spiel, and I don't know if any of you we have time.
Sure, we have plenty of time for questions.
Okay.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yes, sir.
Greg, you've referred to climate change and talk about it in general terms. What does the majority of scientific evidence that you've looked at show has occurred and is occurring in the way of climate change, and what do the trends look like looking forward 10, 20, 50 years into the future? What should we be concerned about based on what you're reading and seeing in terms of science?
Well, there's a feedback that goes on, and by the way, it has been stated that water vapor is the most significant greenhouse gas, and it is. The problem is that the warmer the atmosphere is, the more water vapor it has the capacity to hold. And so if you warm it up a little bit with CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide, then by definition you have more water vapor, which then warms the atmosphere, and it's a feedback. In science, we talk about a positive feedback, and it means something very different than me telling you that you look nice, okay? In science, if it's a positive feedback, then you perturb the system in a certain way, and the feedback perturbs it even more in that direction. So the concern is that with more water vapor, that we might not necessarily have more hurricanes, but those that we do will be more intense than a lot of the ones that we've seen up until this point. And there are different ways to look at that. I think that one thing that bothers me a little bit is there are these attribution studies where every time we have a really significant event like the flood in Texas or the one in South Carolina last year, that everybody wants to rush to be able to say, oh, that was caused by climate change. Somebody, I'm trying to think of who this was. Oh, I guess it was Gore, made a comment after Superstorm Sandy. Well, if you don't accept the idea of climate change now, I don't know what's going to convince you. And I thought about that statement in absolute horror. Does he really think that CO2 caused that system? Now, you can make the argument that sea levels are up over the past century and that exacerbated the flooding in Manhattan. I'm fine with that. But don't say it caused it. That system probably would have been there in some form without any human activity at all. So anyways, to get back to your question, in terms of the hurricanes being more intense, and then just more and more extremes, like there's been quite a bit of study done about the fact that as we get less temperature contrast from the pole to the equators, that we actually get higher amplitude waves in the upper atmosphere, which can actually lead to extremes on both ends. Like we had a couple of really cold winters in the eastern US while the rest of the world was fairly warm. That those types of things are likely to be happening more and more. So that would include drought, that would include floods, all of that. I'm not quite sure I'm ready to buy into the idea that every time we have an extreme event that it's CO2's fault. Natural variability did not go away. We've had, the Dust Bowl, we've had extreme events back in the 30s when the CO2 levels were low. And again, I guess this goes back to what I'm hoping is my main point, is that it isn't all one way or all the other way. That if we have a big storm, people have a right to say, well, how much did human activity contribute to that? Would it have happened anyways? And it's complex. It really, really is. So I don't know if that's a definitive answer or not, but I would say more extremes is what we have to worry about. And then I was at a conference a month ago where I didn't know this, that there's an optimal temperature and humidity for mosquitoes. I guess I should have known that, but I didn't. And that there are some parts of the United States that don't meet that threshold many days out of the year, but if their average temperature goes up and their humidity goes up, then they are in that range for a significant number of days. And mosquitoes, of course, can transport disease and all this type of thing. So it goes just beyond the weather as well. Yes, sir.
One thing I've been impressed by are pictures from satellites of global ice sheets and the shrinkage that allegedly is occurring. Can you speak to whether you consider that factual, and to what degree do you have concern about it?
Well, I have concern about it. Even the most primitive of climate models back in the 80s, and they've been refined a lot since then, indicated that most of the warming would be in the Arctic. And that's exactly where the majority of the warming has been. When I was up at Barrow, Alaska, I talked to a woman there who was born and raised. She's, I think, in her 40s now. And she said, when we used to go trick-or-treating as a kid, she said there was always tons of snow around already in late October. And she said now there's either, very little or nothing. Although she was of the opinion that it would cycle back, that she thought it was just a natural cycle, but she did make that observation. But one of the things that has a big effect if you melt all the ice or it's not there for a long period of time, it changes what's called the albedo of the planet. A white surface reflects most of the incoming radiation right back to space. And if you eliminate that and trade it out for a dark surface, then all of a sudden it absorbs a lot of that incoming radiation. And then the warming rate increases even above and beyond what it was before. And so, again, that's one of those feedbacks. So yeah, I am concerned about it. Another thing that a lot of people aren't aware of is the thickness of the ice, that it isn't just the coverage, but there's seasonal sea ice that comes and goes as it gets warm and cold, and then there's the permanent ice that's there all the time. And a lot of this permanent ice, if you will, is getting thinner and thinner, which means that we're getting closer to the point where it could disappear. We're right now for Arctic sea ice coverage at the bottom of, you take the mean from 1951 to 1980, we're just at the mark of 2 standard deviations below the mean. Whether or not we set an all-time record in September for the lowest coverage, that remains to be seen. but we're awful close. Yes, sir.
There was just a news report that I believe in the Antarctic at the South Pole, there was a ozone hole that was shrinking. Can you comment on that if you are aware of that report and speak to the scientific element of that being true or false?
Yeah, well, when the ozone hole first became an issue, back in the 80s, then the Montreal Protocol was signed, and basically we eliminated, CFCs, and over the course of the last 20 or 30 years, we've actually seen that hole close up, and not completely, but shrink. And that's probably the best example we have of a policy being able to actually lead to some productive conclusion. And again, I'm not of the opinion that the government can solve all of our problems, but I think it is an example of how we can recognize a problem, formulate a responsible plan, and have it do some good. Now, there might be some people that would argue that it's a natural cycle, it would have shrunk anyways. I think over the next 20 or 30 years, we'll be able to ascertain whether or not that's true or not. But there is at least some evidence that our decision resulted in a good thing. Yes, sir.
If you were to believe the most dire of predictions of the climate change
Right.
advocates, how much longer, if we continue the way we are now, no significant change in policy, when would we reach some sort of tipping point that everything begins to go horribly awry?
I don't know that anybody knows that answer. I mean, I don't. I'll just tell you straight up. I think it's one of those things where we're concerned about the fact that there even might be a tipping point, because once you get to that point, there's no going back. But I don't think that we should approach this topic from a fear standpoint of saying that if we don't do something big right now, we're all going to die. Well, we are all going to die someday, regardless of CO2 emission. But I love Kerry Emanuel, who is a professor. He's astoundingly intelligent man up at MIT, and a conservative by his own definition. But he loves to look at it from a risk assessment standpoint. That he said, we're conducting a chemical experiment with the only lab we have. And if we think that there's something we can do to stave off a potential problem, why not do it? He said, now, if we find out 50 or 100 years from now that this wasn't such a big deal and that something natural came along to wipe out all the human influence, he said, what are we left with? We're left with cleaner energy, cheaper energy, renewable energy. He said, those aren't bad things. Yes, sir.
From what I understand, there's a difference between weather and climate.
Oh, yeah.
And so when I hear people argue, they talk about them like it's the same thing. So do you think people speaking that way leads to some of the disconnect between people on both sides of the argument?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to, there's a really good friend and colleague of mine in the field, and I think the way he described it is, he said, weather is your mood and climate is your personality. Which I always thought was a good way to describe it. But I have a good professor friend at NC State, and we had a big cold snap several years ago, and he drove into the cul-de-sac, and one of his neighbors said, where's your global warming now? And again, it demonstrates exactly what you just talked about, is that, number one, we're talking about global, not cul-de-sac-ish, and that, we really have to look at what's going on, over the entire globe and over a long period of time. We can't even really establish climate trends on a period of anything shorter than 30 years, if that. And that's why the normals that we show you, the normal high and low temperatures are always over a 30-year period. Right now we're working off, 81 to 2010. And when 2020 comes along, then we'll update that to the next 30-year period. But yeah, you're exactly right, is that individual weather events don't really tell us a whole lot, unless we have a propensity of extreme events globally, you know, which there probably is a message there. How many people in here consider themselves to be somewhat mathematically minded? Cool, all right. So, and if not, just this is Miller time for you. But like if you go into Excel and plot a graph of two functions, and one of them is y equals x, which is a straight line, and that represents the steady increase in carbon dioxide. And the other graph is y equals sine of x, which is a sine wave, and that represents the natural cyclical nature of our planet. If you add those two functions together, when they're both going up, the resulting graph is going to be up. But there are going to be times when they're out of sync. The one's going up, one's going down. And so at that point, you would expect the overall graph to flatline, or maybe even go down a little bit for a while. So I never understood why there was this discomfort with this hiatus period from 1998 to 2015, in the sense that that's what I would expect, is a stair step. You know, that it goes up for a while and then it levels off, and then it goes up for a while and then it levels off. I would never expect it to go like that. And I was almost a little bit uncomfortable with the new report that came out of NCDC last summer, or NCEI now, I think it's called, is that they modified that they had these old ocean observations where the sensor was in the ocean, and in the time they pulled it out to read it, that there was evaporative cooling going on with the sensor. And so they had to modify that data to try to be more accurate as to what it was when it was still in the water. Well, when they did that, then the global temperature, for that period actually, went up somewhat. And then people start accusing the government of cooking the books, and you're changing the data to make it say what you want it to say. And these kind of modifications have been going on since time began in an effort to make it the most accurate temperature record that we can get our hands on. But now it has turned into, a conspiracy theory where, all of these scientists who work for NOAA are all communists and socialists and Marxists, and they're all trying to work toward one world government and all this kind of stuff. And I know some of these people. They're good, loyal Americans, and I don't know how they took politically, but they, they're trying to do their best in the field they're in.
We have time for one more question.
So is your answer to global warming to not burn any fossil fuels? What's the answer?
To move in that direction, but not to do it irresponsibly. And it is amazing how many countries are moving in that direction. And I guess my fear is the United States continues to argue over the same A and B. And let's look at some of these C's, D's, and E's and see if there isn't a way to make this transition in a reasonable amount of time before we hit that tipping point, and not hurt the economy. It's going to be hard to do it without somebody losing, But if we're aware of that, if we're cognizant of that, then hopefully we can do everything we can to help those people. I don't want to become so gung-ho about I hate to call it a cause, but an acceptance of science that you forget about the fact that somebody might be hurt by that. Oh, and by the way, final thing. There's a climate scientist at Texas Tech who made me realize that I was misusing the word believe for my entire life. Is that she said, I don't believe in global warming, I accept it based on the evidence. If you believe something, more than likely it's something you can't prove, and that could be anything. So if it's a belief system, then it's almost like a religion. And that's not what this is about. This is about good quality science that there have been thousands of peer-reviewed papers written about for 30 or 40 years. And the principles have stood since the early 1800s. So we don't want this to become a religion. Some people may be trying to make it into that. You know, I'm sure there are people out there that are using this as a way to advance their cause, and I don't support that. I'm just looking at it from a pure science standpoint, and there's a lot of good science there.
There was one more question.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I was just going to ask what you thought about the tsunami warning system. I mean, I still from time to time think about what happened in Indonesia where 200,000+ people died in 10 minutes. And has tsunami warning improved since then?
I think they're trying. I know that even in the United States, when there have been earthquakes out in the Pacific Ocean, that there have been tsunami warnings issued for like the Pacific Northwest and, Western Canada. And a lot of times thankfully those waves dissipate by the time they get to the mainland. But I think that was a big wake-up call, that we really did need to do something. And we're probably going to overwarn, and in fact, when it comes to tornado warnings, my gosh, I mean, I wish we were good enough, I really do, and I know you do too, that we could say, if you're at 322 North Main Street, go to your basement, but if you're at 222 North Main Street, you don't have to. We ain't that good, okay? And so I tell people, I said, look, if you go to your basement, or your safe place, or whatever it is with your family, and nothing happens, don't be mad, be thankful. And just think, you spent 20 quality minutes with your family you wouldn't have had without that tornado warning, okay? So, anyways, thank you all very much.